Multi-factor authentication. This, my friend, is something that we first of all need to understand, and secondly, we need to start doing it right now to protect our digital wallets. Let's begin. Our objective for you and I in this nugget is simple. It's how do we protect our wallets above and beyond just using a simple password? And the answer to that is using something called multi-factor authentication. So in this nugget, we're going to take a look at what exactly is multi-factor authentication, why we would use it, which is a quick answer is it makes it more secure so no one can steal or log in as us and take advantage of our wallet. And then we'll take a look at exactly how to use it as we protect the security of our private keys in our wallet. So what exactly is multi-factor authentication? Well, let's break it down into its parts. The word authentication is the process of making something or someone prove who they are. For example, let's say you have a bank and it's an online bank and that represents the bank. There's a roof and they're in business. It takes a little bit more in some countries to get going, but let's say that is the bank. And then we have a user out here in cyberspace that connects to the bank, probably using SSL/TLS, whatever the bank's web server is requiring for that session. And my question is, before this user, the happy user, sitting behind this computer is allowed to transfer funds between bank accounts or send money for payment and so forth, what does the bank make that user do? The answer is they're going to make that user authenticate themselves or perform authentication of that user. And typically, this user is going to authenticate using a single method. Now, a single method of authentication would be called single factor authentication. So maybe we have him put in his username of Bob and we have him put in his password and that's how they authenticate him. Now that's better than having no security at all. I totally agree. But what happens if somebody's looking over Bob's shoulder and they see the keys that he's typing in and now they know his password? Unfortunately, if we use a single factor authentication like just something Bob knows, like his password, anybody with that password could use that and then authenticate and get into the system. So using multi-factor authentication simply means we're going to use more than just a single method of authenticating a user. And that, my friends, is what multi-factor authentication is all about. And that is using two or more methods for the authentication process. So the next logical question that comes up is, well, what are the different methods or factors that we could use for authenticating an individual? And the three primary methods, three primary factors are something that a person knows. And that was like our example with Bob. Bob knows his username and he also knows his password. And that if we just use that alone, it would be single factor authentication. Another method that we could use, let me put a little dividing line here, is we could go ahead and include for authenticating a user a factor of something that someone is. So we'll say is right here. Now this would represent something that the user who's trying to authenticate is. Now we could do a scan of their eye and compare that against our records. We could do a fingerprint scan and compare that against our records. We could do a blood sample. Blood samples aren't great for authentication because they're kind of painful and you have to extract blood and the rest. But that's another factor. So the two factors so far is something that the user knows, like a password, something that the user is, like their eye pattern or their fingerprint and so forth. And the third big factor that we can use is something that the user has. For example, maybe they have a card that has a digital certificate on it, or maybe they have an ATM card. What a perfect example. Let's think about when we go to the bank and we're going to use an ATM card. And like in this example right here, what we have going on is multi-factor authentication. And let's take a look at exactly why. We go up to the ATM. I'm not talking about the networking technology. I'm talking about the automatic teller machine. And we put the card in. The card in measurable terms is something that we have. Now we also have to put in a PIN into the keypad, which is something that we know. So because we're pulling from something that we know here and something that we have, the card, that is an example of multi-factor authentication. And it's very, very good to include multi-factor authentication whenever possible, whenever it's practical, because it is going to increase the security of verifying that the entity, in this case a person, is really the person who is authorized for that transaction. A common mistake that people often make is, well, what if I ask them for a password, right? And then I ask them for a second password. Isn't that a multi-factor authentication? The answer is because those passwords are both something that the user knows, is still considered single multi-factor authentication. Same case with biometrics. If we did a scan of their eyeball, and we did a fingerprint scan, and we took a blood sample, all three of those things, that would still be considered single-factor authentication because we're using that single factor, which is the biological of what that user is. So the goal of multi-factor authentication is to take at least two from different categories, different factors for verifying who an entity is before allowing them permission into the system. Now, the next question almost is self-evident, and that's why would we do multi-factor authentication? There's basically two reasons. Number one, you want to tick off your users. If you make it really hard for users to log in, for example, taking a blood sample and something they know and something they have before you let them in the network, obviously that's going to be a problem. So that would be one reason, I suppose, is to irritate your users. But the primary reason that it should be done, in all seriousness, is to make sure that you have the right person identified. And that boils down to security. I want to make sure that before an individual gets into my wallet online at blockchain.info, and before they're allowed to transfer any or all of the Bitcoins out to other addresses, I want to make sure that that user is me. And to do that, I can include multi-factor authentication. I don't have to just use a password to log in. I can tell the system, you know what, let's use something I know and something I have. The biometric part is way beyond the scope of what we're going to be able to do for millions of people. But we can certainly do something we know and something we have. Now, in the case of something we have, there's several options. We could get, for example, a token generator. Now, a token generator works something like this. It's a little key fob, and every 30 or 60 seconds, there's going to be a number that shows up. And so what we do is we take that key fob that we have, and when we log in, we have to put in our username, our password, so that would be part from this factoring right here, something we know, and something we have, that number generated from the key fob. And that little token generator would give us a number, which would be something we have. So you can think of, well, you've got the token generator and the number that came from the token generator, but that would be a great example of multi-factor authentication. Another option, as far as how we could implement this in a practical scenario, would be something we know, which is our password. We're always going to use the password, but we could also include, I love this option, and that is a text message. We could train the system that when we want to open our wallet, we're going to put in our account info, we'll put in our password, but we also have to put in a little bit of text that came to us via text message on our phone. So that means when we go up to blockchain.info, we put in our account name, we put in the password, it's also going to prompt us for this text, and they have also automatically texted to the phone that you specified a little text message, which you have to put that code in, case sensitive as well. So that would be our additional factor for the authentication. Now, does that mean somebody, if they stole my phone and they knew my password, they'd be able to get in? The answer is yes, but it's a lot more secure than just single-factor authentication. In fact, the other option that I really, really love is Google Authenticator. Oh my goodness, this is great, because in the past, we'd have to have that little key fob that generated a code for us, but we can actually use something called Google Authenticator for a very similar function. So if we wanted to, we could say we want to use multi-factor authentication before we allow anyone to open our wallet, meaning us, open our wallet. That would be our user account name and the password. So we'd have that piece as something we know, and we would also have this number that's generated by Google Authenticator. It's a little app available on Android and on iOS, on the iPhones and such. And this is how it works. Inside of our wallet, at blockchain.info, we're simply going to say we want to do multi-factor authentication. We want to go ahead and use the Google Authenticator. It's going to show us a code. We're going to take the Google Authenticator app, turn it on. It's going to take a picture of that QR code. It's going to link those two, and then that code's going to go away. But guess what? Every time we bring up Google Authenticator on our iPhone, for this account, let's say it's account 123ABC. That's the account name that we set up. For that specific account, every 30 seconds, there's going to be new numbers that show up for that specific account. So that means that when we want to log in, we're going to put our account information as far as the name of the account, which in this case is 123ABC. We'll put in our password, which is required, and it'll also have another field for our Google Authenticator code. which we would open up Google Authenticator and actually take a look at that code that came up that changes every 30 seconds and plug that in within that 30-second window. Click login, and we now have multi-factor authentication. And we didn't have to buy a little key fob doing the specific tokens being generated. We can use an app on an Android or on an iOS device that generates that code courtesy of Google Authenticator. So let's do this right now, you and I. In the previous nugget, we created a little account called Nugget123D, had a little hyphen in there, and we had set up a password. I happen to remember what that password is because I wrote it down. Let's go back into that account up at blockchain.info and let's enable multi-factor authentication, and I'll show you the options available, and then we'll select to use Google Authenticator. So let's begin. Here's the identifier. This is cached. Now, it doesn't cache my password or anything else, but this is the identifier. And just to be sure that I'm on the right account, because I have a few that I've been working with, I'm going to go ahead and put in Nugget-123D. That's our account. And I'm going to put in the password. And if that is correct, when I click on Open Wallet, it should open our wallet for it, which it does. That's fantastic. So we have some transactions. Check this out. I did a couple of other transactions after the last nugget if we want to look at them. So here's when I initially funded it with 0.02 Bitcoin. I sent 0.000600479 Bitcoin, and I also received an additional 0.002 Bitcoin, which at the current exchange rate is currently a whopping 36 cents. Fantastic. And these confirmation numbers represent roughly the number of blocks that have happened since I actually did those transactions. So a new block is created every 10 minutes by the beautiful miners, and each new block is mathematically locked or linked, if you will, to the previous block, which is keeping track of all the Bitcoin just to verify that no one can do things like double spend. I mean, if you send your Bitcoin and they're gone, the whole network knows about it, and it won't allow you to send those same Bitcoin a second time to somebody else. Now, our objective here in this nugget is to focus on multi-factor authentication, how we can turn it on to increase the security of the individual, which is only hopefully us who owns the account, from getting into the account. And to do that, we're going to go back to Wallet Home. And over here on the right-hand side, we have account settings. So I'm going to click on account settings. And all we're going to do is take a look at some basic options and set up multi-factor authentication. So I'm going to say, great, let's go ahead and go forward and saying, you know what? It's been a few seconds since you logged on. I just want to make sure that you're the real user before you continue. So it's asking for my main password one more time, which I'm happily supplying. And now it's giving me the details for my account. So here I could put an email address. So here's my alias, Nugget123D, which we created. And we have additional options, but I want to go down to security. I want to focus on security right here. And right off the top, we have this two-factor authentication. Currently, the default method is just a password. That's single-factor authentication. So for the multi-factor authentication, we have the option of SMS message, which is going to ask me, okay, I need a phone number because I'm going to send you a little code that you're going to need to type in as soon as you want to get into your account. So I have my username, my account name, my password, plus the code I was sent via this text message, this SMS message. Another option is YubiKey. Now, a YubiKey is a little USB device. And what I could do is use this YubiKey, and then when I want to log in, I'd put in my credentials, my password, I'd hit the button on the YubiKey, and that would send information into the system, and that would allow me to log in. So the multi-factor is something I know, which is my account and my password, and something I have is the YubiKey, which is sending in some additional keystrokes, if you will, into the system as well, so it can authenticate me. So those are two different methods, SMS and YubiKey. Email is another option. So if you want to log in, you put in your user account, you put in the password, it automatically emails you the account that you've listed, and then it sends you a code that you would also need to put in. Those are all examples of multi-factor authentication, something you know, your password, and something you have. And that's something you have in the case of SMS would be the text message. The YubiKey would be the physical YubiKey USB device that you're sending the data. And we have the email. Something you have would be the code that they send you. But my favorite option is the Google Authenticator. Oh my gosh, this one is great. What's going to happen here is asking me to go ahead and pair my Google Authenticator device using this QR code. Now this QR code that I'm looking at, all I need to do is take Google Authenticator, the app on either Android or an iOS, iPhone, iPad, etc. Take a picture of this from the Google Authenticator, and it will automatically generate this 30-second timer. Now that is unique to me and this account. So somebody else using Google Authenticator is going to have a whole bunch of different variables in the mix, and their number every 30 seconds is going to be significantly different than my number every 30 seconds. And that would also help me to verify that only I can log into this account. Now this code right here that I'm sharing with you, in post-production, I have edited it and I've grayed out part of it. Why? Because this includes my password. So this is something you would want to do. You'd pair up your Google Authenticator. It would receive it. It would generate the new code every 30 seconds. But this QR code all by itself, if you look at the very tail end of it, has literally the password for my account. So it's not something you'd want to share with globally with the world for your primary account. This is just for you to sync up Google Authenticator. So on my app, on my iPhone, which I've taken a picture of for this, it's sitting right here, I'm simply going to click on the little plus symbol in the bottom right-hand corner on my iPhone, and that's going to invite me to take a picture of this QR code. So with this screen open, I would then click on the little button that says Scan Barcode. And once I've done that, it's automatically added this new 30-second timer for that new account. In this case, it's Nugget123D at blockchain.info. And now, if we want to go back and log in, it's going to require knowing the account identifier or the alias, which in this case is Nugget123D. It's going to require the password. It's also going to require this 6-digit number that is on the Google Authenticator app, which changes for this specific account every 30 seconds. So what I'd like to do is let's go ahead and try this. I'm going to log out in the top right-hand corner. We just simply click on the power button, and that's going to log us out of our wallet. And now we can go back in. Now that identifier, now I recognize it. That's the identifier for our Nugget123 account. But just for grins, I'm going to put in Nugget123 again. And the password for that account, as well as the code for Google Authenticator, which is 769956 for that account, and say, please open the wallet. Now, if I did that within that 30 seconds, it should say, yep, that's great, you're good, and allow me to come in, which is exactly what happened. We have just set up multi-factor authentication, which is a whole bunch more secure than just using a single password as the only mechanism to protect our online wallet. In this nugget, we've taken a look at the benefits of using multi-factor authentication, which boil down to the 3 major categories: something that a person knows, something that a person is, or something that a person has, such as a code delivered via SMS or Google Authenticator. We also have taken a look specifically in blockchain.info at how to implement multi-factor authentication to safeguard our digital wallets. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to do exactly what we did in this nugget. And that is on your blockchain.info account, simply go to the account details, go down to security, and say, you know what, I would like to do multi-factor authentication. And go ahead and pick any one that you'd like. Now, if you don't have the actual USB key, don't choose that option. But if you've got an email or SMS capability, or if you want to use Google Authenticator, I would strongly encourage you to not only try the option of multi-factor authentication, I'd like you to start using it as one of our first steps of really safeguarding our digital wallets. I had a lot of fun. I appreciate you joining me. I hope this information has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.